Today we're going to tie the Grey Wulff. It's my favorite dry fly. It's a fly invented by Lee Wulff back in the winter of 1929 and 1930. And what Lee used was a bucktail and really a doe tail with the fine hair. He wanted that fine brown hair. Remember, all the flies were English in those days. So what we did is we used a fine bucktail, or we could use brown elk hair. And you'll notice the brown elk, not blonde elk, but brown, when you put it right next to the bucktail, it's the same. So I prefer to use the elk hair because it's straighter and easier. And also when he tied it, Lee's flies were rough looking. He didn't tie flies for sale, though he did sell flies years ago. He tied flies for durability, and he wanted a fly that was going to last. And in those days, what we fished with were all pretty much English style flies. So I'm going to use this deer tail, or elk in this case, and put a tail on about one length as long as the shank of the hook. And we're going to tie that in and right down on that. There we go. Right on down. And remember, Lee tied flies in his hand with no vise. He could use a vise if he wanted one, but it's a lot easier to tie with the vise. And Lee preferred to tie them in his hand. I watch him do a lot. So we got about one length to shank, and that's a nice stiff hair. And Lee wanted a fly that was bulky and big, would float well, and would last a long time. You know, the English flies, like the Royal Coachman at that time, fan wing Royal Coachman, you catch one fish on it, and the fly is done. Lee tied his flies very differently, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute as I put my wing on. But being that tied it in his hand, most people think he grabbed the hook by the bend of the hook and tied like I'm doing in the vise. He didn't do that. He held the hook under his fingernail by the eye, and he tied the fly backwards. And he tied the fly very interesting. He tied the tail first, left to right, then the body, then the wing, then the hackle. Work left to right. Interesting. I tie my tail and bring it up half the shank, and then I leave room for my wing. And I'll go back later and then do the body. What I'm going to use for my, what Lee actually used is the fine bucktail. And I think today I'll go ahead, this is a nice looking bucktail. I think I'll go ahead and use what Lee actually used. I use bucktail, or I use the kip tail, which is a little finer and a lot easier to work with. The bucktail for a wing is a lot tougher to work with, but since we're talking about Lee Wulff, I want to do a good job on this, is that we're going to use the bucktail. And of course, he didn't use a hair evener or a hair stacker in those days. He simply stacked it by hand, just like I'm doing here. Get as close as you can. Remember, Lee was an engineer, and his thought was to make a bulky fly that was attractive for big fish. He wasn't looking to sell flies at that time and make the wing perfect. He just wanted something that'll work, and he probably tied it right on the river, though he kind of worked on it in New York City during the winter. So we got that, and that butt of the wing now is going to match up with the butt of the tail to give me a nice, straight, flat place to put my body when I'm ready. So this is the only difference between the way I tie and the way Lee tied them. I'm going to lift that hair up now so I have a nice wing, and we're going to spread the wing too. You know, prior to that, Theodore Gordon and some of the early Catskill tiers were spreading the wings, dividing the wings. But prior to that, Theodore Gordon made a solid wing because it looked like the solid wing of a mayfly. So he just put a clump of wood duck right on the back. So what we did is divide the wing. Now you got something that looks bulky, looks pretty good, and you could see it, and it should last a long time. Remember, Lee was the first one to ever use deer tail for a dry fly. There was people who used it before him for streamers, bucktails, and all that, but he was the first one in 1929, 1930 to use animal hair like this for a dry fly. And it was really revolutionized fly tying and fishing. I'm going to go ahead and lay in a little of this gray Angora rabbit yarn, and I always tie in up above, bring it down so I have a nice flat body. I'm always careful on that. You don't want to tie it in the end and bulk it up. Bring it up front with chenille, no matter what you're wrapping, wool. Bring it up front and then make your body so you have a nice even body upon which to make your fly. It's going to be a good looking wolf. And when they're done, they look just like Lee's except for one little bit, and I'll show you. If you see a fly in a museum or one that Lee actually tied, if you look behind the hackle, most of the time, not all the time, but behind the hackle, you could see a clump of the wing laying over the body where he clipped the wing later. So it's very interesting. You can tell the fly he tied. Mine, you can't see that. So this is what I got here. Of course, I like to use a lot of cement, and Lee used cement too. Put a little cement on there. And then we're going to pick 2 hackles, and Lee used 2 saddle hackles. But nowadays with hackles like Whiting Farms, and Tom Whiting down there, we make hackles, or they make hackles that are unbelievable long. It's just like 2 saddle hackles. So we're going to pick 2 saddle hackles about a size 10. The first fly Lee tied was a size 10. But he used this fly for Atlantic salmon and everything, so he tied them on all sizes. But he liked the size 10, that's the one he started, to match that great big gray drake, well, I think was the Isonychia fly that actually came off in northern New York State, up there on the Ausable River, but we call it the Ausable River. I always pick 2 hackles together, that way they're about the same stems, same length, and I'll reverse them and put the shiny sides out, the dull sides together, and I'll clean off the flue till I get a nice stiff hackle. This Whiting Farms, they're making hackle nowadays like you wouldn't believe. Dr. Whiting can pretty much do what he wants with hackle. He can make short, stubby hackle, long hackle. All right, now we're going to wind that in all the way to the eye. Now I have a nice spot to place my fly. I'm one of the few guys in the world that wind 2 hackles at once. There's several ways of winding hackle, but when I wind it, I put it over the top once, then I bring it back over itself, what I call anchor the hackle, or tie it in with itself, and then I'll do another wrap, then I'll work my way forward, and I want 2/3 of the wraps behind the wing, and about 1/3 of the wraps, or 3 or 4 wraps, maybe 5 if I can get it, in front of the wing, so you could balance the fly. Now my flies, because they're tied in a vise and I take my time, look a little more professional than Lee's. But Lee's looked like they were going to catch fish, and that's exactly why he tied the fly, to catch fish. And durability, remember in those days with that Royal Coachman and some of the other flies we had, they were not durable. The fish slime would get on them, and after you caught a trout or 2, they wouldn't float. Lee finished with 2 or 3 half hitches and then cemented the fly. I'm going to use a standard whip finish, but I learned mine many years ago. 41 years ago, I learned how to do this whip finish in Yellowstone Park, and I was a 22-year-old kid and learned it from an old fly tyer back, member of the Long Beach Casting Club. This is my whip finish. I added this little piece screw here to my vise so I can lay my bobbin, but I do a very quick whip finish, lay it around, put my thumb in. I'll do it for you slow here in a second. A couple of wraps around, I did a perfect whip, pull it tight. I'm going to do it once more for you so you get it slow, and then we'll move on to other things. But I want you to see this Grey Wulff. I'm happy with this fly. Remember, it's easier to use the brown kiptail for the wing than the deer hair, but since I'm doing a realistic Grey Wulff, I wanted to use the fine brown bucktail that's right on the top of a little doe deer. Is even better than a buck, but doe deer tail, very fine. All right, we're going to take this and make a big loop and lay the bobbin up on top of my vise. That's why I have no weight. Tuck that loop underneath, and with my left hand, bring it over the top. Now I've got my starting of my whip. And as long as you don't let go of the thread and grab the wrong one, you're okay. But that's a little slow. Well, years ago, I figured out if I put my thumb inside the middle of the loop, and I turn my thumb and always take the loop toward me, I could bring it right around, turn my thumb slowly, and I lay every wrap exactly the way I want it, and bring it right down to the eye. And the last wrap, if it did it right, it'll slide right up into the eye. And that's a perfect whip finish real quickly. They actually taught that whip finish in the Long Beach Casting Club in the early 60s. And last year I went to the Long Beach Club in California, put on a program for them of casting and tying flies, and I demonstrate this whip finish that they had actually taught in their club before the whip finish tool came out in the 1960s. There's a finished Grey Wulff that I'm happy with. It looks good, it looks like a Grey Wulff should look, and that's ready to catch fish.